Bianca, 32, knew something was wrong in her workplace, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She had started working at the Nova Esperanza institution, a renowned hospital, with high expectations and a desire to make a difference in people's lives. At first, her boss, Dr. Oliveira, seemed like a charismatic and efficient leader, respected by everyone. However, over time, Bianca began to realize that there was something more behind that seemingly perfect behavior. What once seemed like a calm and fair authority figure began to reveal a dark side. Dr. Oliveira, who was supposed to be the example, began to abuse his position to manipulate, control, and humiliate his employees. Bianca wasn't the only one to notice the change. She watched her co-workers, including Roberto, a seasoned nurse who seemed increasingly tired and tense. Roberto, who had previously been an outgoing person, began to withdraw into himself, avoiding conversation with others. His eyes were always tired, and he rarely looked up when Dr. Oliveira walked by. Bianca wondered if this was just a phase or if something more was going on. But the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Dr. Oliveira used his power to intimidate and control his staff, whether with cruel words or abusive physical demands. None of the employees dared to question him, because they all knew the price of rebelling. He had the power to ruin their careers and professional lives. The fear that hung over the hospital was not just a passing sensation. It was real and palpable. Bianca found herself increasingly uncomfortable in her own skin. She feared for her future and her job. When Dr. Oliveira approached, everyone tensed up, hanging on his every word and gesture. Sometimes he would humiliate the staff in front of everyone, making jokes about their flaws and mistakes, no matter how insignificant. But the abuse was not limited to words. Bianca began to hear whispers among her colleagues about the training that Dr. Oliveira conducted in private, where he forced nurses and doctors to work beyond their limits, without rest, and even to perform physical tasks that went beyond what was acceptable. When complaints arose, he always used his power to silence anyone who dared to question him. Bianca knew something had to be done, but she also knew that doing so could mean the end of her career. She wondered how she could possibly report Dr. Oliveira without losing everything she had achieved. It wasn't just the words that made her hesitate, but the unforgiving reality of the institution. Everyone knew that anyone who dared challenge their boss's authority would become a target, and the weight of being singled out could destroy their reputation, preventing them from any future opportunities. She saw the desperation in Roberto's eyes and knew that he, like the others, was afraid to speak out. The fear of suffering the consequences of challenging Dr. Oliveira's power kept them silent, forcing them to accept the abuse that happened there every day. The atmosphere at the hospital became unbearable as the abuse of power intensified. Bianca knew that Dr. Oliveira would do nothing to improve the situation, and at times, he even seemed to enjoy the suffering he caused others. Anxiety took hold of everyone, and even the walls of the hospital seemed to be weighed down by fear. Bianca began to notice how the psychological abuse was reflected physically. Many of her colleagues began to suffer from insomnia, stress, and even more serious illnesses due to overwork and constant pressure. Stephanie, a young doctor, had become increasingly pale and tense. She barely smiled and no longer spoke to anyone. Bianca had learned that Stephanie was dealing with Dr. Oliveira's relentless demands, which forced the medical staff to work overtime without any rest. What had once seemed like a shared responsibility had now become an unbearable burden for everyone. Bianca, despite her fear, decided to talk to Carlos, one of the most experienced nursing assistants, about what was happening. She knew he had worked there for years and possibly had more information about Dr. Oliveira's behavior. Carlos, with a choked voice, told her privately what had happened to some of the other employees who had tried to speak out against their boss. He talked about how one of the most respected doctors on the team had been fired without justification after publicly complaining about Dr. Oliveira's treatment. He destroys you, Bianca. He destroys your reputation, makes everyone look at you as if you were the one to blame. It's not worth challenging his power here, Carlos said, his voice thick with frustration. Those words sank deep into Bianca, who felt the weight of what was at stake. Reporting her boss could mean the end of her career, but she also knew that continuing to remain silent was destroying her integrity. The situation seemed hopeless. Bianca tried to focus on what really mattered, her patients. She loved her job. She loved caring for people, but the hostile environment was wearing her down. She began to feel the psychological effects of the abuse she had witnessed over the months. Every look from Dr. Oliveira, every subtle word of disdain, left her feeling more anxious and worn out. She knew that the abuse was becoming even more psychological than physical, but she couldn't shake the emotional weight of each humiliation she witnessed. Each day seemed to be harder than the last, and the faces of her colleagues, exhausted and disillusioned, haunted her. She knew that if she didn't do something soon, she would be as broken as everyone else around her. But she also knew that by reporting it, she would risk being seen as a traitor, someone who didn't know how to adapt to the rules of the institution. Bianca thought about all the losses she would face if she dared to speak out against Dr. Oliveira, but she could no longer live with the feeling of helplessness. She knew she had to make a decision: remain silent and become an accomplice to this abuse, or risk everything to try to change the situation. She began to observe the other employees more closely, looking for those who might want to join her. Gustavo, a nursing technician with whom she had always gotten along well, seemed to be the only one willing to question some of Dr. Oliveira's more drastic decisions. When Bianca told him what was happening, he remained silent for a few seconds, but then said, firmly, "If we do nothing, he will continue to destroy the lives of everyone here." But even with his words of support, Bianca knew that the path ahead would be tortuous. The fear of reprisals was strong, and the weight of loneliness in the face of the choice made her waver. Bianca spent the next few days immersed in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The idea of reporting Dr. Oliveira seemed increasingly necessary, but at the same time, she felt the weight of the risk. The psychological pressure he caused the employees was immense, and she knew that any action against him could mean the end of her career. Gustavo became her only support in this dilemma. Together, they discussed the possibility of taking the case to a union of doctors and nurses, or even going to the press. However, each plan they came up with seemed to be a new risk. They could not completely trust anyone within the institution, as everyone was afraid of losing their jobs. The hospital had created an environment of terror, where loyalty to the boss and fear of repercussions had silenced any attempt at resistance. However, as Bianca observed the physical and emotional exhaustion of her colleagues, the feeling of urgency only grew. She knew that if they continued to be complicit, the consequences for everyone would be irreparable. That was when Stephanie, the young doctor Bianca had been observing for weeks, began to publicly fall apart. During a staff meeting, she was called by Dr. Oliveira to present a report on the progress of the surgeries performed in the last few days. When Stephanie began to speak, her hands were shaking and her voice was breaking. Dr. Oliveira, in a cruel gesture, interrupted her several times, sarcastically and contemptuously, exposing her flaws in a humiliating way. Bianca felt a lump in her throat when she saw the situation. Stephanie, visibly affected, could not continue and left the room in tears. The atmosphere became tense, and Bianca knew that if this was not enough to make people revolt, nothing would. The abuse that everyone was facing could no longer be ignored. She did not know how much longer she could endure this climate of fear and pain. When she met with Gustavo again, Bianca knew it was time to act. They began looking for ways to collect evidence of all of Dr. Oliveira's abusive actions. They spoke to other colleagues who were willing to join in, but the fear was still strong. Some, like Carlos, were afraid of losing the financial stability that the hospital offered. Others, like Mariana, a nurse who had worked there for years, were just waiting for the right moment to leave without getting involved. Bianca understood the fear, but she also felt that the situation was becoming untenable. When she realized that no one else dared to speak up, she decided to take action on her own. The first step would be to record everything that happened at the hospital: the words, the gestures, the humiliations, the inhumane working conditions. She knew she could no longer hide behind fear. Silence only fueled the abuse. The day finally arrived when Bianca and Gustavo went to see a lawyer who specialized in labor rights and abuse of power. The lawyer, upon hearing their stories and seeing the evidence they had collected, was shocked. He said that the case was strong enough to be sued, but he also warned about the consequences of taking legal action against someone so powerful within the institution. The option to report the case could be a long, risky, and painful path, but he assured them that if they wanted to go ahead, he would support them. As they left the office, Bianca felt a mix of relief and fear. She knew that the battle was just beginning. but she also knew that she could no longer live with the burden of omission. Dr. Oliveira and the institution had taken away everyone's dignity and respect, but now she was ready to fight for justice, even if the cost was high. In the following days, Bianca and Gustavo prepared to press charges against Dr. Oliveira and the institution. They knew the risk was enormous, but they could no longer ignore the injustices that were happening. The atmosphere inside the hospital was increasingly tense. People seemed nervous and scared, and Dr. Oliveira's behavior became even more aggressive. He noticed that some attitudes were beginning to change, that something was going on behind the scenes, but he didn't know exactly what. He increasingly made a point of intimidating and humiliating his subordinates in order to make it clear that he was in control and that no one could challenge his authority. For Bianca, it became clear that the abuse of power was not limited to his personal actions, but was embedded in the very structure of the institution. She knew that by reporting the case, she was not just attacking the abuse of an individual, but questioning an entire culture of oppression. As she prepared to take the next step, Bianca began to feel the weight of guilt and fear. She knew that any wrong move could put her in a vulnerable position, not only within the institution, but also in her personal life. She began to wonder if she was truly ready for the repercussions of all this. But when she looked at the faces of her colleagues, the same ones who saw their careers and lives slowly being destroyed, the decision was made. She could no longer allow Dr. Oliveira to continue doing what he wanted without being held accountable. She knew that the road would be long, and that justice often seemed like an illusion, but indignation and courage spoke louder. Bianca and Gustavo were now committed to the idea that despite the fear, the only way to restore dignity was to expose the truth. The impact of the accusation was immediate, but not in the way that Bianca expected. When confronted with the accusations, Dr. Oliveira reacted in a calculating manner. He took advantage of his status and the loyalty of part of the team to try to turn the situation around, claiming that Bianca was only trying to harm him for personal reasons. Instead of acting quickly and transparently, the institution made a point of discrediting the accusations, trying to lessen the weight of the accusations. Stephanie, the doctor who had been publicly humiliated, was now in a delicate situation, being pressured to retract her statement and side with the administration if she wanted to continue her work. The institution had mobilized to protect its image, creating a climate of confusion and misinformation. But Bianca and Gustavo knew that, at least, they had taken the first step. The truth could not be erased, and now there were more people willing to face the situation. Despite everything, the movement slowly began to gain momentum. Internal pressure within the hospital grew, and many other employees who had previously been intimidated began to stand up and speak out, sharing their experiences with the lawyer. People like Roberto, the experienced nurse, who had begun to distance himself, were now coming forward to give his testimony. Little by little, Bianca realized that her courage was creating a domino effect. The fear was still palpable, but each new testimony gave more strength to the fight. Seeing that others were beginning to unite, she felt more determined to move forward, even though she knew that the battle was far from over. Over time, pressure on the Nova Esperanza institution intensified. The media, when it began covering the case, was quick to expose the abusive practices of Dr. Oliveira and the institution. The coverage brought to light the stories of more victims who, although hesitant at first, began to feel empowered by the courage of Bianca and Gustavo. Public opinion turned against the hospital, and pressure for the institution to take a firmer stance only increased. In an emergency meeting, the hospital management, under increasing pressure, announced that Dr. Oliveira would be temporarily suspended while the investigations were carried out. However, for Bianca, the feeling of victory was bittersweet. She knew that, even if Dr. Oliveira was removed, the real challenge would be to break the culture of abuse and fear that had permeated the institution for so long. Over the next few weeks, Bianca and the other employees involved in the case began to see the slow transformation in the hospital's dynamics. Fear, although still present, gave way to a growing desire for change. The mobilization of employees who had previously felt powerless now became stronger. Some of the colleagues who had remained silent, afraid of losing their jobs or being victims of reprisals, began to unite in support of the cause. Despite all the difficulties, Bianca felt a slight relief when she realized that finally, they were managing to change things. Dr. Oliveira, as powerful as he was within the institution, could no longer do what he did without facing the consequences. The fight was not over, but she felt that she was on the right path. The final decision on Dr. Oliveira came a few months later, when the internal and external investigations reached a critical point. The public prosecutor's office, pressured by the movement and the complaints, determined that the doctor should not only be suspended, but dismissed from his position and banned from working in health institutions due to his abusive practices. When the sentence was announced, Bianca did not feel satisfaction, but rather a sense that justice, however long and painful, had finally been served. The victory was significant, but the damage caused by the abuse of power was profound and required more than a simple dismissal to be repaired. Eventually, Bianca left the New Hope institution, knowing that the hospital still had a long way to go before it became a truly safe and ethical place for all of its employees. She became an active advocate for workers' rights, participating in movements that sought to ensure that situations like the one she had faced would never happen again. Bianca knew that her struggle had not been in vain, and that in the end, fear had been overcome by collective courage. Although the wound left by the abuse of power still ran deep, she believed that the fight for a culture of respect and dignity in the workplace had provided the first steps toward real change. In the end, her story would be one of many that helped break the cycle of silence and abuse that so many people had suffered in the name of power.